Salas, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues from the United Nations, academia, civil society, philanthropy, and the private sector. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sherwin Bryce-Pease, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 16th Salas Memorial Lecture. This year, we are conducting the lecture virtually for the first time. As we say in my world, the show must go on, with or without a pandemic. And UNFPA rightly felt that it was so important to hold this lecture even in an adapted format. In addition to those joining us on Zoom, the lecture is also being recorded and live streamed around the world. The Salas Memorial Lecture Series was initiated in 1989 as a tribute to Mr. Rafael M. Salas, who served as the Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund from the time of the fund's creation in 1969 until his untimely death in 1987. Under his leadership, UNFPA grew from a small trust fund into the world's largest provider of multilateral population assistance. Mr. Salas has been described as a poet, a dreamer, a thinker, a humanitarian, and a superachiever, attributes at the core of working for the United Nations, I'm sure you'll agree, and someone who crisscrossed the globe in search of consensus, something we need today more than ever. Perhaps we might even consider consensus the 18th goal of the SDGs. And it is in that spirit that this lecture series was started, to shine a spotlight on development and population issues to help us think big and forge consensus in a changing world. Let me introduce to you our distinguished guests present at the opening panel today. Her Excellency, Ms. Amina Mohammed, is the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Our lecturer this year is Lord Mark Malloch Brown, who many of you will know from his time with the United Nations. Ambassador Carmelita R. Salas, widow of Mr. Rafael M. Salas and the former ambassador of the Philippines to the Czech Republic. A warm welcome to you, ma'am. Dr. Natalia, Canon, Executive Director of UNFPA. We also have two distinguished guests with us who will be joining Lord Malloch Brown and Dr. Canem in a panel discussion later. Ambassador Olaf Skog, the head of the EU delegation to the United Nations, and Ms. Kessie Ekomo-Soine, the Executive Director of URU, the NGO in the Central African Republic. A warm welcome to all our guests. Today's lecture will have two parts. First, we will have introductory remarks, followed by the lecture by Lord Malloch Brown. This will be followed by a high-level panel discussion. Now, it is my honor to give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Amina Mohammed, United Nations Deputy Secretary General, for her welcoming remarks. Over to you, DSG.
Thank you very much, Sherwin. Dear Lord Malloch Brown, dear Natalia, dear Ambassador Salas, Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, and very many friends that I can see coming up on our screen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 16th Rafael M. Salas Memorial Lecture. Rafael Salas was the first executive director, as we all know, of the UNP Population Fund, who understood very early on the links between population and the broader development issues. In many ways, his thinking foreshadowed the integrated nature of the Sustainable Development Goals. The lecture provides us a really important space to take inspiration from fresh insights as we look forward to achieving our common goals in the decade of action. Mr. Salas was a statesman, and as we heard, a visionary and a poet whose ideas and actions shaped UNFPA from its earliest days and were instrumental in fostering global consensus on population issues. This understanding took hold through the program of action of the International Conference on Population and Development that was held in Cairo in 1994, and which continues to guide our work in promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights for all, and ensuring the centrality of health and rights in sustainable development. Since Nairobi, we have seen notable progress. There have been significant reductions in the numbers and the rate of women dying from complications of pregnancy or childbirth. Families are healthier, and young people are more connected and empowered than ever before. But still, too many lives are being left behind. Sexual and reproductive health problems are a leading cause of death and disability for women in the developing world, and young people bear the highest risk of HIV infection and unintended pregnancies. Many millions of girls risk the prospect of child marriage and other harmful practices. Now COVID-19 threatens to reverse hard-won gains UNFPA's projections have shown that owing to disruptions in programs and services, the pandemic could result in millions more cases of child marriage, female genital mutilation, and unintended pregnancy. And we've seen skyrocketing gender-based violence. As we embark on the decade of action to achieve the SDGs by 2030, it is imperative that we don't fall behind and that we address the gaps to achieve gender equality. This is a goal in itself and key to achieving the other 16 goals that we have collectively committed to. And that is why the theme of this year's Salas Lecture is so relevant and timely, namely development after COVID-19, stretched resources and strained communities. I can think of no better a person to talk about that topic than today's speaker, Lord Mark Malloch Brown, a global champion for development, for multilateralism, and of course for the United Nations, which was once his home for a number of years. Lord Malloch Brown is no stranger to many of you here today. During his time at the UN, both as administrator of UNDP and as chief of staff to Kofi Annan, and then as the DSG, he led efforts to ensure that the UN could deliver results that matter. And he understood the value of the UN delivering as one and was an untiring advocate for human rights, for reform, for peace and security, and most especially for women and for girls. Lord Malloch Brown's work in the private sector, in government, in philanthropy, and in civil society, including as co-chair of the United Nations Foundation Board of Directors, has supported the paradigm shift to sustainable development, always probing and asking, how can we make the world a more equal place, a more resilient place, a more peaceful place, and how can we live up to our loftiest ideals and goals? As the Secretary General said last month at the General Assembly, COVID-19 is a dress rehearsal for the world of challenges to come, and solidarity is self-interest. And that's why I'm delighted that Lord Malloch Brown has chosen a topic that can help us to think through the responses to those challenges and reimagine solutions that will be needed for us to keep on track to deliver on the 2030 agenda. Welcome back, Mark. I thank you, and I look forward to engaging and stimulating Rafael Salas Memorial Lecture.
I thank the Deputy Secretary General for those remarks, and let me just repeat, solidarity is self-interest. That's something we should all get ingrained in our brains. I'm now pleased to give the floor to the Executive Director of UNFPA, Dr. Natalia Canon. Madam Edie, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Dear Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Amina Mohammed, Lord Mark Malloch Brown, the Ambassador Carmelita Salas, Chef de Cabinet Maria Luisa Viotti, Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. Thank you all for joining us for the 16th Rafael Salas Memorial Lecture. Rafael Salas saw population as the mother of all development questions. He recognized early on the interlinkages between population, gender relations, environmental sustainability, demographic patterns, culture, politics, religion, and economic performance. Mr. Salas faced an uphill battle when he began work for the new Unknown Fund in 1969. His first order of business, calling on every head of mission who would receive him, visiting everyone in and outside the United Nations system to inform them about what would become UNFPA. Many were not receptive to even talking about population on issues like family planning. But Mr. Salas remained undaunted. He stated, quote, "The question of poverty, its eradication, and the allied questions of development and population are in the end questions of morality. We should not become so closely involved in the question and consideration of the morality of specific means of family planning that we lose sight of the wider issue, which is not less than the physical, mental, and moral well-being of mankind." Mr. Salas urged countries to look beyond numbers. Quote, "Interest in population is not a concern with the figures on a chart of the curves of a graph alone, however important they may be. But is essentially an involvement with the future of humanity itself. And he was persuasive, dramatically increasing the fund's resources, scope of activities, and global footprint over the course of his tenure. UNFPA has come a long way over the past 5 decades, from a budget of $2.5 million and a staff of 5 to a nearly $1.5 billion global organization with 5,000 people on the ground in over 150 locations. Along the way, yes, we faced setbacks and pushback, funding cuts, growing demands, crises, conflicts, and now COVID-19. Whatever the challenge, we always come out fighting. We always come back stronger. In the face of opposition, we look for and find opportunity, just like Rafael Salas did. That's UNFPA today. As a result of our can-do spirit, wide-ranging public and private partnerships, and a deep dedication to protecting the health and rights of women and girls, fewer women today die while giving life. More women and couples are able to choose whether or when to have children, and more girls are in school. But now COVID threatens to shift the goalposts. You picture a girl, she may be 12 years old, she may love school and have a head for math. She dreams of a decent job, eventually marriage and a family. But now with the pandemic, her dreams are evaporating. Her parents may have lost their jobs. Many nights she may be going to bed hungry, and certainly no school, no computer. She's not part of the digital world for virtual learning. And what she doesn't suspect yet is that she may never return to school, because in a few months she may be married off to lessen the burdens at home, and a year from now she may be pregnant, and soon she's caught in a poverty trap that will jeopardize her health, that will jeopardize her ability to be productive for the rest of her life and her children's lives and onward across generations. So we know that it doesn't have to be this way. We know that smarter, deeper investments in health and education, including in sexual and reproductive health, with services, with information, that's what's going to help this girl and millions of young people like her to drive progress and prosperity for all. Just as Rafael Salas crisscrossed the globe to forge consensus on population and development issues in those early days, today it falls to all of us to commit and recommit to the spirit of consensus and common humanity, and to build back better and greener from COVID-19. I believe we're so fortunate to have as our 2020 Salas Memorial Lecture someone who is exceedingly well positioned to reflect upon the complex interplay of these pressing issues and to consider the United Nations' role in building consensus, in building those partnerships to address these very, very important considerations. And of course, I speak of none other than Lord Mark Malloch Brown, the former Deputy Secretary General, former Administrator of UNDP, and Chief of Staff to Secretary General Kofi Annan. Lord Mark Malloch Brown, on behalf of all of us at UNFPA, I thank you for readily accepting our invitation, and we look forward to a lively and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you so much.
I thank Dr. Canon for her intervention and for those sobering remarks. I am now delighted to introduce the remarks of Ambassador Carmelita R. Salas. Her remarks have been pre-recorded. Mrs. Salas has been incredibly helpful in preparing for this lecture, sharing a wealth of materials with the organizing team and underscoring the role of Mr. Salas that he played in promoting consensus and in focusing on the multi-dimensional nature of population issues and their connection to such critical topics as the status of women and their empowerment, the importance of civil society, gender, and human rights. Please, can we play Mrs. Salas's remarks?
It is a singular honor for me, and indeed a pleasure, to be at the 16th Rafael M. Salas Memorial Lecture. Executive Director Dr. Natalia, Canon, thank you for not letting COVID-19 interrupt the series and forging ahead with the virtual lecture. Lord Malloch Brown, Excellencies, distinguished guests and friends, Rafael marks his beginning at the UN with a 17-syllable Japanese haiku. Mist on 38 floors, morning breeze from Turtle Bay, hand clasp at the door. Mist to me depicts haze, uncertainty. On that historic day in July 1969, when Neil Armstrong returned from the moon, Rafael arrived with not even a scrap of paper to show he was going to work for the UN. The position that Mr. Hoffman had offered him to take did not formally exist. The exchanges between them had been oral. Now here he was in New York with only the word of Mr. Hoffman that there was a task to be done and he was the man to do it. But Mr. Hoffman's word was as good as his bond. The position was officially created and Rafael appointed. Hand clasp at the door. Let me read from People and International Choice, a book he publishes 6 years later. The accomplishments of the fund in the past 6 years have been due to the very large number of individuals that made it, some of whose names appear in the book. My own personal contribution has been the creation of an organizational environment in which talent was allowed to perform at its best. It was a wise Asian who once said, "Success is evident when everyone who helped in the task can say with conviction, 'I did it.'" And that is what I would like to have done here. Help build an organization which has done the task assigned and is capable of doing its job as long as there is need for it to do so. Formidable challenges remain. But I see in the UNFPA, with Dr. Canon at the helm, passionate about her mandate, and her dedicated and undaunted staff worldwide, I see, with sheer joy, an organization eminently capable of meeting the task at hand. It is my profound hope that the lecture series will reach a wider audience and help them understand the evolution of the fund, the issues that help shape it, and the continued importance of its work.
I thank Ambassador Salas for her address and for bringing to life some of Mr. Salas's poetry and for reminding us of the importance of learning from history as we move forward. Mr. Salas shared an anecdote from Mr. Salas's early days at the United Nations. Said one ambassador to him, quote, "You come from the Philippines, a good country, and are no doubt a good man. Sit on my sofa, drink my coffee, but don't even try to talk to me about population." How times have changed. I would now like to introduce our lecturer, Lord Mark Malloch Brown, who is no doubt familiar to many of you today. Mark is the co-chair of the UN Foundation Board of Directors and senior advisor for the Eurasia Group and is active both in business and in the non-profit world. He served as Deputy Secretary General and Chief of Staff of the UN under Kofi Annan. For 6 years before that, he was administrator of UNDP. He was later Minister of State in the UK Foreign Office covering Africa and Asia and was a member of Gordon Brown's cabinet. He chairs or is on the board of a number of non-profits, including the International Crisis Group and the Open Society Foundation. Lord Malloch Brown will deliver today a lecture entitled Development After COVID-19, Stretched Resources and Strained Communities. With that, I'm delighted to invite Mark to deliver the 16th Rafael M. Salas Lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and Madam Deputy Secretary General, Dr. Canon, Ambassador Salas, and a lot of friends and colleagues, some of whom I got a glimpse of in the gallery screenshot at the beginning. It's wonderful to join you all today. And let me start by saying I think I may be the first lecturer in quite a while to have been lucky to have known Rafael Salas personally. I consider him a mentor, both in my early introduction as a journalist to UN development work, but also through the Philippines, where I was later an advisor to Cory Aquino, who defeated Paeng, as his Filipino friends know him, longtime nemesis Ferdinand Marcos. And that's where I'd like to start today, in the Philippines. Salas's story, a student activist who went to work for the initially reformist Ferdinand Marcos, and then the discreet falling out as the reformer became the autocrat, frames an eternal development dilemma. How do countries push aside special interests and build an inclusive development model with room and a voice for even the poorest Filipino, without one corrupt patronage system being replaced by another? Both then in the Philippines and later as administrator of UNDP, I felt part of the answer was functioning democracy at the country level. But in conversations with Rafael Salas, including when I traveled with him to China as a young journalist to report on the two-child family policy, I quickly realized, actually one-child family policy, I quickly realized free choice for poor people is a lot more than an election every 4 or 5 years. It's about gaining the power and voice to make a future for yourself and your family, to find a basic economic security for them, and to access the education that will determine their future. Freedom is about freedom from hunger and ill health, and the freedom to learn, as much as it's the freedom to vote. And I learned from watching Salas that delivering that agenda is not a preserve of national actors only. The multilateral system can be a critical champion and catalyst for its delivery. When he left the Philippines to become the population advisor at UNDP, fears of a global population time bomb were rife. Population growth in the global south was exponential, and the spectre of Malthus, whose 1798 paper on how population growth would outrun food and resource supply, so generating a violent correction of the balance between man and nature, hung heavily over all the discussions. Western dominated development institutions' efforts at population control were seen by many in the South as having the consequence of suppressing non-white demographic growth. This was also the time of the new international economic order, a drive by the leaders of the least developing countries to reset the terms of the global political economy. Efforts to suppress Southern population growth in that context sat uncomfortably for some with this agenda. Few, if any, doubted that population growth needed to be addressed. But in the rancorous, distrustful post-colonial era, it was an ambition easily imbued with negative associations. And indeed, use of coercive sterilization, most infamously in India, fed that distrust. Salas changed that. In 1969, Paul Hoffman, the first administrator of UNDP, split out the UN Population Fund from UNDP under Salas as its first executive director. The crafty Hoffman had chosen a national and churchgoer of one of the world's largest and most devout Catholic countries as his agent of change. What Salas did was remove the debate from one of high politics and ideology to that of individual choice. Poor women suddenly had the prospect of some control over their own lives. This was not population as a factor of planetary survival, but rather population broken down to its most intimate individual part, a woman's choice to manage her own reproductive life. Demographic outcomes would be the sum of those individual choices, not of state diktat. The history of UNFPA since has been a steady extension of these services to those most denied them, combined with advocacy on their behalf. From Salas to today, that has been UNFPA's revolution. I salute Comrade Natalia, now leading that demand for choice and so for freedom. For me, years later, as the new head of UNDP, how Salas had changed the terms of the debate was an influence in my own embrace of what became the Millennium Development Goals. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. We needed to democratize development in the same way Salas and his successors had democratized reproductive health. We had to hold a torch for the poor and shine it on the black box of official development assistance. We had to make it accessible and accountable to the poor, while also converting the ivory towers of development policy in New York, Washington, Brussels, Beijing, or elsewhere to a new, simple core development proposition, addressing the basic needs of the poor. In a pre-COVID age, when we still all went to our offices, we saw it as creating a new global water cooler conversation. I should just add that two redoubtable and remarkable partners for me and for UNDP at that time were UNFPA's executive directors, in turn, Nafis Sadiq and Thoraya Obaid, both who served during my tenure as chairman of the UN Development Group. At the national level, I imagined an MDG politics, governments measured by their electorates on MDG outcomes. These were to be available in easily accessible reporting formats, which would allow comparisons with neighboring communities or countries. And at the global level, the disputes between my previous home, the World Bank, over fiscal adjustment versus a human-focused development championed by my new UN colleagues, or the debates between countries over state-led versus market-led development, would all be subordinated to progress on a single universal scorecard, the MDGs. Now, I just want you to bear in mind these two examples of UNFPA and the MDGs as we turn to the COVID affliction that goes much wider than just its direct tragic health impact. Shortly, I will argue that the crisis has accelerated the moment for another development revolution. Can we seize it? But let's hold that for a moment, because first, COVID. A terrible public health crisis has killed 1 million plus and made tens of millions ill. Nevertheless, today it gives some false comfort. Not all countries have been equally hard hit. Age structure, population density, even debates about certain possible population-wide immunities are raised in explanation of this, as well as, of course, uncertainty about the quality of national statistics. And certainly, decentralized public health systems used to coping with infectious disease and devoted to preventative strategies have proved better in many cases at protecting populations than many highly centralized, expensive, hospital-based care systems. Africa accounts for 17% of the world's population, but only 3.5% of COVID deaths. And above all, observers seem to agree that the quality of government has mattered more than the quantity. The United States, with the most expensive medical system in the world, has had 65 deaths per 100,000 population. Vietnam has had 0.04 deaths per 100,000. However, around the world, the COVID-19 focus of health care has left other vital public health interventions unaddressed, from vaccinations to cancer treatment, the delivery of mother and child health care. Kids everywhere have been out of school, and all the data tells us girls are less likely to return. Across the world, rich and poor, there has been a dramatic shrinking of educational opportunity, and I speak today in the midst of an apparent second wave of the disease, certainly in Europe and North America, probably globally. Yet it is the economic tail to the pandemic that may leave the most lasting damage. The last time this much of the world was in recession was 1870. For a time in late March and April, essentially 85% of the global economy was locked down. Subsequently, the implicit assumption has lingered on that things will bounce back as we discover a vaccine or COVID disappears like the Spanish flu strangely did a century ago. This overlooks a fundamental point about COVID. It's not a random black swan, but rather a highly predictable occurrence. In many ways, the disease of globalization, modern travel quickly carried it to all corners of our integrated global economy. Two quick but thoughtful books rushed out by their authors to tell us what will or should happen next, both quote Lenin. Sometimes nothing changes for decades. At others, decades of change can happen in weeks. The world is not going back to be the same as it was before. The massive destruction of both the supply and demand side of our economies has caused damage. Jobs, firms, and whole economic sectors have been lost that won't come back. Bounce back in demand as lockdowns have been lifted has been euphorically greeted as a recovery, but it's well short of full recovery. World GDP has shrunk by around 5% this year. The ILO estimated a drop in global working hours during the second quarter equivalent to the loss of 400 million full-time jobs. Women workers have been hit particularly hard because of their overrepresentation in the worst hit sectors. Additionally, there's been a massive contraction in informal sector employment, in remittance earnings, and the undermining of the whole support system that keeps those on the brink of falling back into poverty from doing so. The World Bank estimates that 115 million people have been pushed back into extreme poverty. That's less than $1.90 a day. As Bill and Melinda Gates have put it, quote, we have been set back about 25 years in the course of 25 weeks. Statistics never capture it all. So let me recount briefly one woman's story from the Gates Foundation supported project Pathways, which follows the lives of ordinary Kenyans. Sylvia from Homer Bay on Lake Victoria was born with HIV and lost both her parents to it. She's the proud and loving mother of a 4-year-old daughter, Gift. That name speaks volumes about how much she means to her mother. Sylvia earned a living as a counselor at the HIV clinic for affected mothers, where she is herself a patient. Now they can no longer afford to pay her. Her treatment, Septrin, is still available, but at 30 Kenyan shillings or 28 cents a dose, over a month, that is twice her rent. Her landlord, an old family friend, is usually understanding, but now he has money troubles of his own, so is demanding to be paid. She tries to earn some cash by washing clothes and braiding hair, but the customers can't pay her. And Gift is now out of school. Very differently, last week, British Airways retired its last 2 Boeing 747s. The jumbo jets that were once almost synonymous with long-haul business and leisure travel, making dozens of transatlantic trips daily. When at UNDP, I sometimes thought I spent more nights on them than in my own bed. The airlines don't anticipate passenger levels recovering to pre-pandemic levels till 2024 or later. In most Western capitals, a widespread collapse of both commercial and home real estate prices is anticipated. We may be enabled by Zoom and its competitors, and it's changing the anatomy of work in direct ways. I'm talking to you from my home outside London, let alone from New York. It's unlikely the pendulum will swing as far from big city life, though, as some predict. It's a brave forecaster or killjoy who would count New York City out. I first worked at the UN in New York in 1976. Taxes, broken services, and crime seemed to be its death sentence. We who made it our home in the years since know how wrong those doommongers were. But even a partial shift from how things were spells major economic consequences for developing countries. Globalization, as we know it, had already begun the long unravel. For much of the decade, trade as a percentage of global GDP has plateaued. Already, the increasingly hostile and defensive competition for spheres of influence and commercial dominance between China and the US was leading to a reordering of supply chains and investment decisions. That's been accelerated by COVID as business leaders have started to think in terms of supply chain resilience rather than efficiency alone. It may still be cheaper to source from China, but is it commercially prudent or politically expedient to be exclusively dependent on a source that is increasingly caught up in confrontation with, for many global companies, their most important stakeholder, the US? Compounding these supply chain changes is the growing corporate and governmental response to climate change. I talk to a lot of boards and managements about climate risk. The big initial takeaway from COVID was elation at getting nature back. As an Indian friend told me, as the smog lifted, you could see the Himalayas again from Amritsar. Peacocks were back on the streets of Mumbai. Temporary but heart-lifting gains from the stilling of traffic everywhere. Then came the regret. We should have seen this coming. What's the next such crisis? Earlier in Australia and currently still in California, devastating fires plus brutal hurricane seasons elsewhere have led businesses everywhere to wake up if they hadn't before. Events like floods in Bangladesh, nothing new, but again worsening after years of improved flood management, or a long drought in South Africa's Cape Province have brought home the challenge. The UN Foundation, which, as you heard, I'm proud to co-chair under Ted Turner, has, with many other groups, led the push towards greater shareholder and institutional activism. Annual meetings of companies have become an uncomfortable moment of climate accountability for many boards. However, with businesses everywhere also facing liquidity and solvency stress because of COVID, these pressures alone might not be enough to make them invest in new business models, except that governments too have stepped up, similarly recognizing that climate is the next COVID. The Eurasia Group analysts estimate that governmental recovery packages around the world are running 2 to 1 in terms of support of a green versus brown recovery. The underlying direction is clear. Governments and corporates are increasingly aligned behind a green transition. President Xi of China galvanized the official climate change world with his words at the UN General Assembly in September. We aim to have emissions peak before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. As Adam Tooze, the economic historian, observed, quote, with these 2 short sentences, China's leader may have redefined the future prospects for humanity. With governments doubling down on green bets, green infrastructure as a recovery strategy, and green technologies as a longer-term competitiveness strategy, businesses are climbing on board. The commercial logic is increasingly compelling. I chaired the Business Commission for Sustainable Development. Our principal report, Better Business, Better World, argued that sustainable business models could unlock more than $12 trillion in new market value and create 380 million new jobs by 2030. Business models that embrace a circular economy and shared ownership offer dramatic business opportunity. For example, the current life of a privately owned car is a quiet one, on average parked and idle for up to 90% of the time. A business model that delivers shared ownership of that car is a win-win for the owners, who share the cost, the environment, and the business provider. Overshadowing all the opportunities that we identified was the seismic shift from fossil fuels to renewables. Now that shift is gathering unstoppable momentum. Today's renewables have a lower capital and operating costs than traditional fuels. And as a rule of thumb, every $1 million invested in renewables generates 7 or more jobs, whereas the same amount in coal is 1 to 2 jobs. Coal, as Mark Carney, the Secretary General's Special Envoy on Climate Financing, has declared, is now a stranded asset. Investors and lenders beware. That said, the pace of transition from fossil fuels seems likely to be slower in the global south as energy demand ramps up. And that's despite its frequent advantages of weather and geography in terms of solar, wind, and hydro. And as Europe prepares to set tariff standards for imports that have generated carbon emissions at their point of origination, the rate of transition to renewables may become a highly contested political issue. A two-class energy world of smokestacks in the south and windmills in the north may seem to turn history on its head, but it carries political, trade, and health risk we would do well to avoid. Let me return for a moment to that world of a temporarily reduced economic pie. GDP will be smaller for some years to come. Within that, countries will have a very uneven capacity to protect themselves. Governments have, during the crisis, provided some $12 trillion of support to firms and households. However, whereas in rich countries, these measures amounted in many cases to a double-digit percentage of GDP, in the poorest countries, it was often a couple of percent at best. While emerging market economies were able to access the debt markets for the financial equivalent of ventilator support, raising some 124 billion since March, not a single country in sub-Saharan Africa, as Kristalina Georgieva, the IMF managing director, reported in a speech last week, has been able to access the international debt markets in this period. She went on to say, quote, "This calamity is far from over. All countries are now facing what I would call the long ascent, a difficult climb that will be long, uneven, and uncertain, and prone to setbacks. We are all joined by a single rope, and we are only as strong as the weakest climbers." The IMF estimates global public debt will equal 100% of GDP in 2020 and leave heavy job losses, bankruptcies, and an impact on people of impaired health and education services. For UNFPA and the wider UN family, the case for a multilateral fight back, Kristalina's single rope that holds us all, might have rarely seemed more needed. And the performance of a UNFPA endorsed by record levels of donor support, or WFP with its handsomely earned Nobel Peace Prize, or the prominence in government and corporate discussions of the SDGs would seem to suggest a UN in fighting form for the task. But the reality is a bit different. The UN's 75th General Assembly showed a UN membership increasingly divided between big powers who seem to have imbibed the Kool-Aid mantra of their own country first, and smaller powers that amidst growing turbulence cling more firmly than ever to the life raft of multilateralism. In the development and humanitarian space, we simply can't wait for these wider questions of the UN's future political legitimacy to resolve themselves. You need to be relevant today. You are needed. That requires understanding of what post-COVID development will look like and your place in it. The Economist this week offered its own prediction. Quote, "The pandemic will leave economies less globalized, more digitized, and less equal. Within countries, service jobs may move from cities to suburb. Sectors like technology will explode, others will fall back. ExxonMobil has already dropped out of the top Dow Jones ranking. Oil stocks everywhere are broadly down 30%, and renewables up 30%. Among countries too, there will be new winners and losers. After it's all over, The Economist again suggests America may quite quickly recover its levels of economic output. But China will even more quickly be 10% bigger than it was before, and Europe smaller. Among developing countries, there'll be a similar story of cards shuffled. Some will benefit from supply chain diversification. Others will suffer from overseas consumer spending constraints on their garment and other export sectors, or as remittance earnings fail to recover. Some countries will seize new opportunities in fintech to revolutionize financial service access. Others will accelerate the shift to renewables, and still others will find their own niches as everything from tourism to services and manufacturing and agriculture is remade to shorten and diversify supply chains, increase sustainability, and emphasize ethical and, for that matter, organic supply chains. It will be a brave but smaller GDP world out there. And so in addition to encouraging countries and companies to seize the opportunity of change, there will also be a need to help with the transition costs, the safety nets and retraining for those left behind by these changes. The poverty map will be different as places and groups are thrown back into agonizing poverty and others gather economic speed. And the international aid agencies will be less well-resourced perhaps to respond. As always in a crisis, donor countries are feeling pressure to bring spending back home. Those donors who calculate their aid volumes as a percentage of their GDP will find an opportunity to cut spending. And as the new US-China Cold War, if that is what it tragically proves to be, gathers pace, there will be pressures that we will have not seen since the 1980s to use aid as a political patronage tool to build loyalty in a two-block world. Never good news for aid effectiveness. So how do development actors such as yourselves navigate this new world? First, as I've said, read the map. Just as rich world governments will trim their aid flows, in developing countries, higher levels of public debt and lower revenues means smaller government seems likely. But as this crisis has shown in the success of, say, Singapore, which has low government spending to GDP, quality and priorities can matter more than size. In its case, a laser-like focus on education and an investment in a top-class cadre of policymakers has paid for itself many times over. So we need to re-engage the debate about what kind of government developing countries need. Too many governments, North and South alike, simply don't pass the competency test. COVID has shown them up. Whatever its size and wherever the country, it's a safe bet that citizen expectations of government will have changed. There will be less talk about lower tax and free markets and more about resilient social safety nets and health and education systems that are fit for purpose. The Reagan-Thatcher model of open markets and a small state seems up to the challenge. The Scandinavian, Northern European model has had a better crisis than the Anglo-Saxon US-UK one. And a number of Asian countries such as South Korea, Vietnam, or indeed New Zealand have had a much better crisis still. And as I said at the start, low-cost preventative healthcare systems in West Africa or parts of Asia have outperformed many of the big private or public health systems that were seen as poster children in the past. There is likely to be profound shifts in where we look for successful models in the future. And where we do still look primarily to governments for service delivery, it may be mayors and cities or other subnational actors as much as national institutions. The success of Germany in its COVID response is attributed by some to a decentralized, city-controlled public health system. The C40 gathering of mayors has proved a more dynamic global force in many ways than its plodding state counterparts. At UNF, we're proud of our support to a group of US state governors that have kept their states on track for emissions reductions in line with the Paris Agreement, even as Washington has trashed and exited the agreement. The private sector, in its many shapes and forms, from multinationals to SMEs and the local informal sector, will be even greater shapers of development opportunities and challenges as they remake economies, disrupting old industries and making new ones. It will take them further into previously public sector-led areas like health and education delivery. More than ever, they will be the major providers of jobs. This is exciting because of the prospects for innovation and growth, and frightening because where is the accountability? For a citizen, a corporation can be even more impenetrable than a government. It will also raise profound ethical questions about data protection and access of poor people to digitized services they cannot afford. Issues of citizen opportunity versus citizen exclusion could become the new class or caste war of politics. And the answers aren't always easy. In part, China beat the pandemic faster and more thoroughly than the West because of its unrestricted access to personal data. It's able to deploy big data and AI in ways the West, with a focus on data privacy, has disallowed. The rest of the world will have to make their own choices between effectiveness and privacy. China, it might be said, gave their citizens health protection at the expense of data protection. National civil society is likely to be a growing force too in service provision, and also in the battle for rights in developing countries. As I've said, post-COVID government is going to be resource strapped. Where it could not provide good health or education systems before the crisis, it's unlikely to do so afterwards. Not for the first time, civil society is likely to fill the space, particularly in provision for marginalized groups. As national civil society has grown, so has its intellectual leadership and soft capital, and so has the diversification of its funding model. BRAC, the Southern NGO I'm lucky enough to know best as a board member, has grown into a sophisticated force, both in Bangladesh, where it has more than 90,000 staff, and abroad. At home, in addition to its core activities in frontline health and education service provision, it has a microfinance operation with a loan book in the US billions, a large mobile fintech business, a bank, an extended and profitable range of social enterprises from craft garments to bull semen, skills training centers, and a prominent university. The funding model combines donor flows with revenue streams from these other activities. Abroad, through TED, they've won an audacious grant from a group of prominent philanthropists to spearhead the international promotion of their ultra-poor graduation program. This draws on a continuous process of research evaluation and program improvements, as described in the work of the Nobel economist laureates Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, the work about creating highly individualized interventions to put communities and individuals on the path to sustainable livelihoods. I report this not as an advertorial, but rather as one example of how the development ecosystem has changed. If there ever was, there certainly is no longer a monopoly of wisdom or practice anymore for UN agencies or Western INGOs. Whether it is BRAC or, say, the White Helmets in Syria, best practice is found in the front lines of our work, not the donor capitals of old. The UN funds and programs can be partners and cheerleaders of this change. I see this in Bangladesh in the partnership of the resident coordinator, Mia Seppo, and her country team have with BRAC. So for UNFPA and its UN sisters, a new environment, new partners, but new challenges, renewed poverty and inequality, indebted government and indebted and weakened government in many places, a private sector remaking economies for better and worse, a more empowered set of local partners, and the UN itself facing this landscape with tightened resources. In closing, some compass points for that future. Engage in the debate about what good will look like after the pandemic. What are the lessons of COVID response? What worked and what didn't in the health field? Which are the delivery models that need to be emulated? What is the preferred public-private model of health delivery? In an era of weaker government and dependence on a network of other commercial and not-for-profit health delivery systems, how does UNFPA ensure that poor women continue to receive affordable reproductive health support? There are tried, if not always effective, means to hold government to account for health services to the poor. As non-public provision increases, how do we hold the new providers to account? They're more elusive and scattered than a national health ministry, and often a lot more opaque. When rights in general seem likely to come under pressure, UNFPA must ensure its agenda for teenage girls, women, and children is protected. Hold on to the SDGs as a critical organizing and campaigning framework. Amina Mohammed has done a fantastic work in establishing their global significance with help from so many of you. And the crisis has revalidated their relevance, and at this point, they enjoy the endorsement of governments, the private sector, and civil society. They draw on the UN's convening power for their inspiration, but also for driving forward their progress. And finally, on these points, never forget those that are left behind or left out. When in 1969, Rafael Salas established the UN Population Fund, he turned on its head how the UN addressed population. It was suddenly, as I said at the beginning, not a geopolitical issue, but a matter of woman's choice. Development was made personal, taken from the conference rooms of Turtle Bay to the simplest bedroom in the poorest villages of the poorest countries. It was an expression of solidarity, but also of respect. It was putting power in the hands of the most marginalized individual, the poorest women. In an environment that has changed for all of us, Madam Executive Director, you must again find the key that opens to where people can be in charge of their own lives, the ultimate test of development. Thank you.
I thank Lord Mark Malloch Brown for his intervention, for that lecture. And I'll just remind those that might have just joined us that that was under the title Development After COVID-19, Stretched Resources and Strained Communities. So I'm just going to do a quick recap before we move on in the program. He talked about how Rafael Salas focused on an inclusive development model, population broken down into its intimate parts. Salas changed the terms of the debate, addressing basic needs of the poor, development made personal. COVID created circumstances, and I'm sure the DSG and UN officials will like this one. It created the circumstances for a developmental revolution. The world is not going back to what it was before. Women have been hit disproportionately hard due to them working in the sectors at the front lines that have been hardest hit. Mark quoted Bill and Melinda Gates. I'm going to quote Mark quoting Bill and Melinda Gates. We've been set back 25 years in the course of 25 weeks. He talked and highlighted the importance of how business models are changing and that they need to deliver shared ownership. The race towards renewables could become a political issue. All countries facing a difficult ascent. We're all joined by a single rope. I quite like this, but we're only as strong as the weakest climbers. And the Secretary General also talks about this in the context of healthcare as it relates to COVID-19, Mark, that we are only as strong as our weakest health system. He also talked about nationalism versus multilateralism, a brave but smaller GDP world out there. The poverty map is going to change after COVID. If the US-China Cold War accelerates, it's bad for everybody. He raised the question, what kind of governments do developing countries need? He talked about the private sector, how they will remake economies and industries and making new ones, and the ethical questions we have to ask around that. What about the ethics around that? He said the development ecosystem has changed. Best practices found at the front lines of our work, not in donor capitals. Engage in the debate about what good looks like after this pandemic. Hold on to the SDGs. Never forget those who are left behind. I hope that does justice to your 30 minutes, Mark, in 2 minutes. All right. Before we move to the second part of proceedings, the panel discussion, we now see a short video about Mr. Rafael Salas.
preconceived population questions within the UN system. This covers all the spectrum of what is known as population, from demography and statistics to family planning.
As you have seen, the UNFPA that Mr. Salas first led over 50 years ago has only grown in strength, building on that solid foundation and the vision that he created. If you've just joined us, you join us for the 16th Rafael M. Salas Memorial Lecture delivered by Lord Mark Malloch Brown. We have about 55 minutes for the second part of this discussion, our panel discussion. I would like to now introduce our high-level panelists who will be joining Lord Malloch Brown. Dr. Natalia, Canon, the Executive Director of UNFPA, Ambassador Olaf Skwerk, the head of the EU delegation to the United Nations, and Ms. Kessie Ekoma-Soine, the Executive Director of URU, an NGO in the Central African Republic focusing on youth, peace, and security issues. After initial questions, which I will pose, we will have a chance to take questions from the audience. I would kindly ask that those wishing to pose a question do so by writing your question in the chat function. Please do not raise your hand. All questions should be posed through the chat function. Please also indicate if your question is for a specific person on the panel. I ask each panelist please to keep their answers to 3 minutes or less. The virtual clearing of my throat will begin exactly at around 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Lord Malloch Brown, I begin with you, sir. Looking beyond the pandemic, how do we guard against a return to business as usual, right? This is a question that many people that work for the UN have asked themselves over generations. How do we get our leaders to take the sustained action required, and how do we forge the kinds of partnerships needed to ensure that we both embrace the vision for development of the kind that you've been spelling out?
Well, I suspect we're not going to be given much choice. I think business as usual is rapidly going to be seen as just something that simply the world passes by those who refuse to adapt or adjust. I think the challenge for the United Nations system is at a time when sort of money talks and the resources that the IFIs have are so critical and central to recovery in the poorest countries. It's very important for the UN system to find a way of inserting its voice into the debate. And I know that, you know, been a very important meeting of finance ministers at the GA this year, and that the Secretary General and DSG are both making huge efforts to make sure that UN voice centered on the needs of the poorest is heard loudly during the discussions. But again, as I said in my lecture, I mean, the critical thing is to have a group of leaders in all development organizations, big, small, international, local, who kind of get the changed landscape, that government's not going to be the same. It's going to be a changed private sector. It's going to be new sectors of the economy that are coming up and others falling behind. And so it's going to need versatility and adaptability to change development models and partnerships to take advantage of the growth that's coming, while at the same time making sure you're focused on mitigating the pain and transition of those who've gotten left out by the change ahead.
Ambassador Squirg, if I can bring you in, how can we keep up the focus on the SDGs and women and girls in particular in these difficult times when the domestic pressures are so large? In your experience, how can we hold governments accountable to their SDG and their ICPD, of course, the International Conference on Population Development Commitments? Over to you, sir.
Thanks very much, Sherwin, and I have to say that I really admire your upbeat tone and energy during this discussion. Having listened, and I'm still trying to recover from the excellent presentation, but very dire presentation by Lord Mark Malloch Brown. And I think one of the challenges we will have, those of us who work here in the UN system, is to really maintain the vision, the drive, and energy to do what I think he's rightly points out, that there's a remarkable amount of change that is needed to fix and to look forward. I think you mentioned, Sherwin, the whole situation for women and girls, and I think it's important to remind ourselves, not just when we are discussing under the UNFPA stewardship, but broadly in the UN system, how the COVID has laid bare the glaring inequalities in our societies across the board, but maybe particularly when it comes to the vulnerability of women and girls. In terms of schools closed, the progress we have made in terms of education for women and girls have, of course, been set back because of the lockdowns. The unpaid care, domestic care work that is, disproportionately falling on women has been falling on them even more. The sexual and gender-based violence that Amina Mohammed mentioned is just horrendously on the increase. And at the same time, you have the heroes of this pandemic is usually the front runners in the health industry and the health sector, which are women, but they're also incredibly vulnerable, both in terms of exposure to the pandemic, but also I think in the fact that on some of the services that they benefit from or should benefit from has been closed down because of the pressures on the health system, including sexual and reproductive health and rights. Now, I just, and I think this is difficult, but it's important that we remind ourselves the dramatic measures that we have taken confronted with this crisis, and that they should also, teach us that we are able to set in place such drastic measures in the face of a crisis. It's just that this one has been so imminent, but there are other crises out there, and Mark mentioned the climate crisis. And I think there's another one on the inequality of the gender inequality crisis that we're confronting. We need to just have the same kind of mentality that it is possible to close Wall Street, close Broadway. I'm not suggesting those are the measures we should take, but it's just a lesson here that we are able to take some incredibly dramatic measures. And now we're all scrambling to rebuild our economies. Well, let's do it in a green way that creates jobs, as Mark was saying, but also to finally tap into this inequality gap. It's not a question of solidarity. That is just an untapped potential in growing our economies by including women into those economies. So more women at the table. I was, counting the number of leaders speaking here at the UN General Assembly, the biggest diplomatic powwow in the world, 193 countries represented. There were 9 women 9 women, ladies and gentlemen, speaking. The first one, I think, appeared days after the debate had begun. I think it was this Slovak president. So we just need to show by example that that is not sustainable, and it starts at home. It starts, how we the culture, we as leaders in our workplace, the culture of equality that we have to just start implementing. The second is more investment in women and girls, and that includes equal pay, transparency in how board selections in boards are made. And the EU is taking very forward-leaning directives and regulations in this respect. Last point, maybe, Sherwin, is about the violence against women, particularly the gender-based violence. The EU is putting forward spotlight initiatives to highlight these things, working with the UN, etc., and working with UNFPA. And there is a strong, I think, political awareness of this problem. We just need to translate it into action, legislation, follow-up, etc. Final point, and this is response to, I think, Mark Malloch Brown too, about this, that some global powers are talking about the contradiction between, your national security first, and then multilateralism is in the second tier of priorities. That's not how we see it. And I think one of the positives coming out of this high-level debate is that most countries, if you count them, including a major power, the European Union, is very clear that for us, national priorities go hand in hand with strengthened international cooperation, a stronger UN, and more effective multilateral cooperation. Thank you very much.
Great ending there, Ambassador, because you preempted. I was going to ask you a follow-up question about, as the EU ambassador with so many different parts that you have to lead at the United Nations, the conversation between nationalism and multilateralism, that is a big sticking point as we move forward. But let me go to the next speaker. We'll do a second round and come back to you. Dr. Canon, if I can bring you in. You often talk about empowering that 10-year-old girl, right? Wherever she might be. As we are seeing in this crisis, and indeed crises, is that women and girls who are left behind are being left behind even further, whose rights are being trampled on even further. What would you say are the main actions we need to take now to protect and empower women and girls, and what are the risks associated with inaction?
Well, thanks so much, Sherwin. And I must congratulate the 16th Salas lecturer. Thank you so much, Lord Malloch Brown. We wanted a stimulating discussion and debate, and you've really put so much on the table. Pertinent to this question of women and girls, why? Why is it that the girl and the woman is the one that's going to be hit hardest by a crisis, and COVID-19 has been no exception? Gender-based violence is skyrocketing under these so-called lockdown conditions where women don't have free mobility. And of great concern to UNFPA and the UN as a whole, child marriage, genital mutilation, teen pregnancy during COVID are on the rise, right? So the first thing that I would say, and I have to say this loud and clear, the rights of that woman, that adolescent, that girl are not negotiable. And we have to defend those rights through any adversity. And certainly that would include the sexual and reproductive health, the reproductive rights of that woman and that girl. Why? Because it's essential to gender equality and Sustainable Development Goal number 5. It's essential to women's respect. And that's what empowerment is about, the ability to move around in the world with confidence and respect. And we have a Secretary General who's leading on this with his Initiative for Peace in the Home. We have a Deputy Secretary General who has been vocal and visible on these issues. For UNFPA, the actions that we would like to see, supply lines must continue, and that's a cooperative activity that we do in partnership. Contraceptives and menstrual supplies, these are biological needs that have to be delivered even with COVID. So that woman and that girl who picks up a phone to call a hotline needs to know that essential services are going to be there and that someone is going to come to the rescue. So we really believe that asking the question, as the lecturer did and as the ambassador just mentioned, who is being left behind, immediately swivels your attention as to what should we be doing. So if that unique vulnerability is by an indigenous woman, indigenous people harder hit by COVID, Afro-descendant people harder hit by COVID. If you're disabled, whatever the issue may be, for that woman and that adolescent, if she's facing cultural barriers or legal barriers, if she's out of school and now accessible to be preyed upon, these are forms of discrimination that as a human society we have the ability to do something about and that we can no longer ignore. Data is important. I have to emphasize that point. We need to know who is being left behind, where they are, what are their needs, and to count that. And this is part of a population exercise that looks at who's being left behind. And I have to tell you, everyone, all hands on deck, need to be behind that woman or a girl. You don't have to be a woman or a girl to champion everything that I've just said. And just to end, I'll say this is why I personally put my trust in young people. I'm so glad that Kessie is here to speak for herself in her own voice on behalf of a generation that's 1.8 billion strong. And you know what? They're showing concern about climate. They're actually showing concern about the older generation that's being hit harder by COVID. When you look at who can lead the next fight, and I think DSG alluded to this earlier this morning in a conversation we had, we need to equip young people to get out there and understand the Sustainable Development Goals and what it means for their own rights. So let me leave it there.
Dr. Canon, I'm going to stick with you just for a second. I'll bring Kessie in a moment. I'm just going to quote some of the remarks made by the SG at his UNGA address this year. COVID-19 threatens to set us back even further. Gender-based violence is skyrocketing during this pandemic. Child marriage, female genital mutilation, and adolescent pregnancy are all on the rise. We need urgent action, strong political support, and targeted investments. Otherwise, gains achieved painstakingly over the decades are at risk. You participated in the Beijing Plus 25 commemoration not so long ago. How desperate a situation is this really, right? In terms of losing the gains that have been made over the last 25 years. Just speak to that briefly.
It's a catastrophe. Look, these events take 1 second to happen, but the consequences last for a lifetime for that woman, for that girl. So when we talk about additional cases of gender-based violence, all the way up to femicide, the murder of a woman, right, usually by an intimate partner, maybe in her own home, this is unacceptable in the most egregious manner. And we should not turn a blind eye and pretend that all is well. For every 6 months of lockdown conditions, UNFPA estimated, and sadly it seems like it's happening, an additional 31 million cases of gender-based violence on top of what we already had, which was 1 woman in 3. So yes, I think in our work, we're eager to work with governments, with civil society, with faith-based organization, with anyone of good faith who understands that when there's a wrong that can be righted, we should do that. So ultimately, I think we track these statistics knowing that there's a human being that has been hurt. There's a human being that's demanding justice for what's happened to her. And that when we say reproductive health and reproductive rights, as Rafael Salas himself embedded in UNFPA, we're talking about the fundamental issue of intimacy in the family and respect for that girl as she traverses her adolescence. We want her to come into her womanhood fully equipped to be able to contribute to her society and to know that she has a place in this world.
Thank you, Dr. Canon. And as you said, all hands on deck required to make that a reality. Let me bring in Ms. Kessie Ekomo-Soinet. As we look to build back better, how can we engage young people more meaningfully? And what does that engagement look like? How do young people want to be engaged on this, especially in countries where there are peace and security challenges? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking me your question. And hello from Central African Republic. And so I think that the question you are asking is one of the big questions of the last 5 years, how to engage young people meaningfully. And I think that the question of the participation and contribution of young people in the room and outside the room is key. And there is a lot of progress, but the meaningful component, I think, includes the importance to acknowledge that what young people say, what they think, what they do has a value and can be used and implemented. And I think that with the pandemic of COVID-19, we realized that young people has a really important role to play. In countries such CAR and in many countries, young people still carry the weight of social, cultural prejudices, not just in communities, but also in institutions such as the UN, and it impacts the way we try to work with them on the daily basis. I think that there's a work to be done, not just to change the mentality, both with our leaders and within diplomatic agencies, but also peacekeeping mission, where I think the contribution of young people is still very limited to communication, actions, and I think we are missing the substance of their contribution. And if I take again the example of CAR, and based on the work that my organization is doing with young people and the government, the UN and the EU, the conflict and recently the pandemic shows that young people represent a segment, once again, of the population that everyone thinks to know, which make them transversal, in peace building or development strategy. But I think that including young people in a meaningful way, it's important to try to find time to get to know them, to recognize that they are diverse. And COVID-19, once again, shows that in the way young people manage a pandemic on a daily basis. I think just thanks to the resolution 2250, I think Dr. Canon talked about the importance of data. And thanks to the resolution 2250, I think this is the first time we see that in different countries, government really decide to try to get to understand the place, the needs, the aspiration of young people and how they can contribute to peace and to development, on the long term. And I think that if we do not work, we like to say that young people are the future, but for so long, we didn't really think about the future. I mean, because we didn't really invest in those young people. And I think that COVID-19 doesn't give us the choice. Now we have to think the future. It's like the time stopped. And now we try to rethink the world, the way it will work, and where everyone finds its place, where women will be, which kind of role they can play, how young people can also contribute. And I think it's something really strong. And in CAR, once again, and in partnership actually with UNFPA, we have developed a participatory analysis on the need and aspiration of young people. And this document, this is the second edition. We are working on the second edition. And I think the government recognized the fact that this document helped them to try to think CAR tomorrow, and including in the context of COVID-19. And I think the lack of documentation, of data, of information on young people really change the way we think their meaningful contribution. But things are moving. And I think it's something that we should take with us in our institution, but also in our government, in our organization. The last thing that I can say to answer to your question is that ensuring that the need and aspiration, as I just mentioned, of young people, I consider is not enough. I think we must ensure that their action they carry on the ground. And really, trust me, in CAR, even myself as a young person, I was surprised to see how young people in that context of COVID, because it makes us, the context of COVID, take us back to a kind of context of conflict at some point. But I was surprised to see that how the creativity of young people in that context. And so for me, engaging meaningfully with them, it's also taking the time to wear those glasses, to try to see what they do differently and how the creativity can be also a lesson, for all of us, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, great response. I mean, take the time to get to know young people, wear glasses to see their perspective. Thank you so much for that intervention. Let's do a quick second round before we take questions from the audience. Lord Malloch Brown, the Secretary General said last month at the General Assembly that there are 5 horsemen out there that endanger our common future. Geostrategic tensions, you touched on that. Climate change, you touched on that. Global mistrust, you touched on that. The dark side of the digital world, and now COVID-19. And these issues are all interconnected. All of this can be quite overwhelming, I'm sure you'll agree. So how do we plan and respond coherently in ways that put us on that upward trajectory that you also spoke of? And what is the role of agencies like UNFPA in that mix?
Well, I think the poor Secretary General is going to end up getting a stable, because I think every year he has to add another horseman. Some of those issues you mentioned have been around a while, but the latter two, COVID and the whole sort of dark side of digitization, and technology are all coming issues, and I don't think that's going to be the end of it. I think we've already had discussion here also of inequality and other things. So in a very real way, the landscape's changing, and these profound and fundamental threats threaten international peace and security, but they also threaten individuals' economic security and well-being and their futures all over the world. And I think the first thing to say about the UN system is, above all, it's got this megaphone and convening power to identify these issues and put them on the global agenda. And I always think my own experience with the Millennium Development Goals, now happily overtaken by the more ambitious and sophisticated SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. But the MDGs, a group of us sort of moonlighted to write them, really, because and we drew on a lot of already published ideas, etc. But but my day job was reforming and restructuring UNDP, and it was a very rewarding but very exhausting day job. And then on the side, I, very much at the behest of Kofi Annan, was trying to form these Millennium Development Goals and assemble the teams to pull it together. And it was probably a fraction of my working week or working year at the beginning to get it done. But when I look at the return on that time versus all those painful hours spent on internal UNDP restructuring or the restructuring of the UN Development Group, it was that MDG initiative which lit the light, which changed international development. And I think, the UN has always got to resist the temptation to immerse itself in its internal restructuring priorities, and instead go back to that critical value added, that unique set of assets it has as a campaigner and a voice for these issues, and to translate those powers from the kind of conference room world of the last century to the social media and youth constituencies of this century. So it's, if you like, it's an old mission, but very much in a new bottle. And I think it's a challenging reinvention, and it's very exciting to hear the other panelists, Dr. Canon and everyone else, speaking to this need for this kind of change.
Ambassador Squirg, if I can bring you back, I touched on this question when I moved on from you earlier. The challenges we just discussed, such as the pandemic, are all, of course, global. But we also know that all politics is local. So how do we balance protecting national interests while also supporting the common goals? You talked about the green economy. Just in 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. Look, I think what the pandemic has also shown us is this tremendous interdependency of countries, of people. And I think that blurs a little bit the paradigm that you talk about, how everything is local in the end. Because I think also on the local level, one realizes that we're not safe where we are in a little village unless people are safe elsewhere. So I think that has blurred the line a little bit. Secondly, I think, and it's great to listen to Kessie as well, but for the meaningful participation of youth, because I think that is something new as well that is slowly finding its way through the UN system and the global debate. And we know through various polls that have been made and surveys that most youth today around the world are actually looking to more international cooperation. And they are familiar with the SDGs and how the SDGs can also represent for them an ask for their governments, be that on the local level or central level. And that brings me to the other point, which is accountability. And I think the virtue of democracies is that people can hold their governments to account. And there has to be much more of that. And that's why I also think that democracy and the SDG 16, a strong institution, is part of, the reason why we're pushing that so hard too, is that the accountability is there, and that will be key to getting through to the implementation of the SDGs, I believe. The last point I wanted to make, Sherwin, is that one of the positive trends, even before COVID, was precisely the engagement of youth, making their voices heard in a much more tangible way than in the past. And secondly, I think is the whole private sector turnaround that over the last few years, and hopefully will accelerate the way Mark Malloch Brown just described in his lecture. And those two massive forces will insist and I think put pressure on governments in a way that we haven't seen in the past. And I think those are some of the optimistic and positive elements that we should be harnessing moving forward.
Okay, I did say we'll do a full second round, but I'm going to sort of shake things up just a little here and take a question from someone that's joining us virtually. Latanya Mapp Fret, President and CEO of the Global Fund for Women. You have a question, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. And this is just an incredible, lively discussion. I don't think I was expecting it. So thank you to Dr. Canon and UNFPA, who always, I feel like, pushes the envelope. At Global Fund for Women, we are really concerned, as all of us are here, around feminist movement builders, the collective action, the civil society that we're seeing even under this pandemic more so being repressed. And so I really wanted to think together with all of us here, how do we ensure that civil society, how do we ensure the collective action in this time is seen as a nucleus for growth, as Lord Malloch Brown talked about us having a revolutionary development outcome after this. And as we know, civil society is much more than just one group. It is services that are provided to society, pushing back on repressive governments, getting out the vote, even in countries like mine. How do we see us working together to get out of this in a new way, a renewed way, where we see civil society and collective action being respected as a vehicle for this growth?
The question is for Lord Malloch?
Yes, let's start there. Yes, please, thank you.
Please unmute.
Okay, sorry, a little sticking point there on the unmuting. Look, I mean, I think the issue is really to right-size our ambitions for the scale of crisis of the moment. And the way to right-size the UN ambition is to bring civil society into into defining that ambition and as the sort of soldiers and partners in achieving it. You know, the biggest constraining factor of the UN has been its intergovernmental character since the beginning. It is both its greatest asset, but also its greatest handicap. Its greatest asset because it gives it an authority that no NGO can have, but its greatest handicap in that, you know, there's always a risk that it's constrained to go no faster or further than its most cautious member state wants. And what UNFPA and UNICEF, you know, and others have, you know, modeled so effectively, you know, is the campaigning UN, which makes relationships and partners with others outside who can afford to be much more ambitious than state partners can be. And I think that's the key. I mean, the UN really of the future has got to be the UN with a whole new, if you like, stakeholder class at its core, particularly in the social and economic. I think it's harder in the political and security. But that is this class of civil society, and particularly of younger civil society, because otherwise, you know, its ambitions are always going to not only fall short of what people want, but or expect of the UN, but fall way short in terms of achievement.
Kessie Akomasonya, let me bring you in. This was a question about civil society, right? How we best engage civil society post this pandemic. Just weigh in, if you will, from the youth perspective here.
I think that's the question of like including young people. As I just mentioned, I think that the role of young people after the post-life after the COVID-19 will completely change the way we perceive the role of each individual or each group in the society. And I think the role of young people will be also questioned. And I think including, because for me, young people, we represent a part of civil society. Once again, I'm sorry to always use the context of car because this is where I live and where I work. But I really feel and I see that the way the government perceives us because of the role that we play during that pandemic changed the weight of us in the peace building process, but also in the way the government think about the development of the country. So I think it really depends of the space that the government allows to young people, but also the way we organize ourselves to really not just contribute on our side, but also fit with a more global or national strategy in the way we provide our support to our country.
Thanks so much for that intervention. I'm going to move right on to the next question, and an intervention from Mary Ann Etibiet, Managing Director from Merck for Mothers. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the esteemed panelists and guests on this lecture. My question is for Lord Malloch Brown, and really appreciate you highlighting all the ways that COVID is germinating seeds for the evolution of our development ecosystem. My question is in particular about the public-private partnerships that you highlighted and the agility that we're seeing in subnational partnerships. What can we take from the successes of some of these public-private partnerships? What can we learn from them, especially with regard to enabling actions, policies, processes, and environment, so that we can use them to accelerate progress towards the SDG? Thank you.
Well, assuming it's coming straight to me, let me just say that, I think we've been through a kind of initial, rather unsophisticated period of public-private partnerships where, agencies were almost counting them like scalps. How many do you have? And where we've arrived at, which is where we need to get to, is a point where, these partnerships are assessed by their impact. Do they deliver development results? And along the way, I think it's matured the way that the UN and civil society side look at the private sector partners. At the beginning, there was almost a naivety that, it must be completely disconnected to the private sector's business objectives. It must be provable CSR or philanthropy. It mustn't touch on the business. Whereas, I argued from the beginning that, if you want it to be sustainable, and I'm now talking about financially sustainable, you've got to allow partners to do things for which they can, over time, generate a revenue base to justify to their shareholders and managements as to why they're doing it. So, I look at one of the past masters in this space, Unilever, one I happen to know well, but, Unilever has been incredibly generous in its partnership with civil society and NGOs, both around, distribution of soap and other materials of that kind to improve washing programs, hand washing programs in the period of COVID, but also incredibly ambitious and around things like supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's brought its UN and NGO partners with it. There's an understanding that Unilever is a better business for having these partnerships, but that one day the people they're helping now will reach that point in their economic development and growth where they can afford to pay the full but still modest price for a Unilever bar of soap. And, you know, so as we've kind of got away from this idea that it must having nothing to do with a company making money, and instead understand it must be aligned with a company's business objective while delivering for us on our side of the table real development outcome, more cleaning capacity for poor communities. I think we're arriving at a point where, you know, these partnerships are getting designed with the right balance of understanding from the two sides.
Right, so I'm going to read a couple of questions that have come to us through the chat function from David Sunderland to everyone. So I'm going to pick on Dr. Canon, who hasn't spoken for a while. Thank you, Mr. Malloch Brown, for the wide-ranging and challenging lecture. You mentioned that increasingly UN organizations will need to be partners and cheerleaders of change, which for civil society, as it takes a more prominent role as government capacity diminishes. How should the UN itself change to reflect and encourage this? It's kind of framed towards Lord Malloch Brown. Sorry. Dr. Canon, would you like to intervene?
No, let's allow the lecturer, absolutely. And I'm happy to add on if there's time.
Well, no, look, in a way I touched on it in the last answer in a way. And, you know, I think, again, it just comes back to these points of vision and ambition on the UN side, a willingness to reach out to partners that the UN has been circumspect about in the past, while at the same time always sticking to the values that underlie our work. We're not for allowing business to gouge the poor or, you know, a bunch of other things, many of which we've touched on in this lecture, but just to sort of scale our ambition to the scale of the problem and not think that we can just get there by the quite limited means available to spend now. I mean, you know, it's fantastic that UNFPA has gone up from $2.5 million to 1.5 billion, but still compared to the challenge of health rights for the poor around the world, that's still, I'm sure Dr. Canon would agree, a kind of bit of a drop in the ocean. So those imaginative scale-up partnerships to be able to deliver to scale and ambition, you know, are critical tools of the UN's trade in the future, I think.
Erin Anastasi to Amina Mohammed and the UNFPA Executive Director. Among those most left behind are women and girls living with obstetric fistula. Following UNFPA's DED in brackets P presentation of the UNG's report on intensifying efforts to end fistula by 2030, what more can member states, the UN system and the UNFPA-led global campaign to end fistula and key partners do to ensure that the SG's recommendations are implemented, that we achieve the goal of member states adopted in 2018 in a UN resolution of ending fistula by 2030 in order to secure health, healing and dignity for all women and girls, and that we achieve the SDGs. Madam Deputy Secretary General.
Thanks, Sherwin. Great question. And I think the opportunity of COVID, and often Natalia has talked about this, it's not just about us dealing with the response we have now, but doubling down on what we need to do with existing resources that go to universal health coverage and making sure that this is an integral part of the spend. And so I would say that now keep up the advocacy, and that civil society and young people need to engage parliaments where these appropriations for stimulus packages will be agreed, and ensure those line items right down there in the domestic resources are available, and we can get that out to people. So keep up the advocacy, engage parliaments, and look at those stimulus packages for the opportunities.
Dr. Kanema, in the next question, and you can sort of do them both at the same time. Susan Jim of the Pero Volley Africa Research Centre, University of Bristol. Thank you for the wonderful introductory remarks and the excellent lecture. Lord Malloch Brown articulated his concerns on how countries are challenged in balancing their national and overseas interests. Has the pandemic adversely impacted the commitments pledged at the Nairobi ICPD 25?
Well, thanks so much for the set of questions. In fact, the resolve coming out of Nairobi, and we were led there by Deputy Secretary General, was voluntary commitments, and we're paying attention to the follow-up phase. I will say that we need to be intentional. We need to be purposeful and decisive. Another thing that Amina Mohammed always says is that if you're thinking about who's left behind, who is poor, who's marginalized, who, by gender, whatever the dynamic may be, by disability, you need to ask them what it is that they wish to see. What is the change that they are looking for? So in our case, we are scaling up our efforts on fistula together with governments, because under the United Nations reform, country-led is now something that is sticking. So as we shape the agenda together with countries, the tragedy of a fistula, an injury during the birth of a newborn, which affects the mother again for her lifetime, this type of injury is entirely preventable. It means that the health system missed the prenatal care. It means that the mother was in labor for too long. There was no transport or motorcycle or horse or whatever to bring her to care. I'm very proud to say, and this is partly an answer to some of the other questions as well, that in a refugee setting, UNFPA has seen fit to spend our resources in the hands of those NGOs, those civil society organizations, those community midwives who know who is being left behind and how to find her. So ultimately, I think as we scale up efforts, I just want to reiterate that data is going to be very important to monitor the voluntary commitments coming out of the Nairobi summit, to monitor what we're doing this year when it's Beijing plus 25, an action coalition on bodily integrity. This is a way of also upholding the rights of women and girls. And I think we have that roadmap in the Sustainable Development Goals to build back better and greener and bluer for that matter. And it's been very exciting to see Bretton Woods institutions, community groups, the hope that people have that we're not going to lose the opportunity, quote unquote, of COVID as a crisis to change the dynamics of this world today. Thanks.
I'm going to bring back Ambassador Squirg and Kessie, please, for this question. From Sarah Pantoliano, as Mark eloquently illustrated, new and exciting forms of multilateralism are emerging that can play a critical role in reinvigorating global cooperation efforts. This multi-stakeholder multilateralism tends to favor voluntary pledges over binding obligations. Good luck with this one, Ambassador. Going forward, how can we make sure that this trend does not dilute the legal basis of human rights and impact negatively on rights holders? Over to you, sir.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Very pertinent, I'm afraid, because you're absolutely right. There is a bit of a challenge out there for those of us who really stand up for both better inclusion in the UN system and better dealings with the human rights norms and improving them and how they're implemented and respected. So this is a bit of an uphill struggle, I have to say. We're working on both, that I can assure you. The European Union is very, very actively working with the President of the General Assembly to ensure both that, this whole new stakeholder model is consolidated, more private sector engagement, more inclusion of civil society, meaningful dialogues with youth, but at the same time, no backtracking on the norms relating to human rights. And of course, on human rights, it is the governments that are to be held accountable. And here we've seen pushbacks, efforts at adopting new resolutions that actually are moving the needle backwards rather than forward. So I think the answer to how we protect all this is the same as the one on the SDGs, and that we really need everyone to get engaged. Put pressure on your parliaments, locally, regionally, centrally, put pressure on your government representatives to defend all these rights, and get globally engaged so that youth get together, globally to put pressure on governments all over the globe.
Kesi Okomo Soingna, the same question, right? We're talking here about stakeholder multilateralism through that tends to favor voluntary pledges over binding obligations. Going forward, how do we make sure that this trend does not dilute the legal basis of human rights and impact negatively on rights holders? Final word to you.
I think that it's a question that I ask to myself sometimes, like, because I was in Nairobi, and I was like amazed by the fact that all those people like engage themselves voluntarily to, you know, to play a role. And for me, I don't see exactly if there's a threat, you know, by the fact that they are engaging themselves for that. But I do think that is something that we have a role to play to be sure that it will happen. And I think that it's some as Dr. Kanam just mentioned, like the role that we have to play just to really be sure that we commit women and young people together to be sure that they push the agenda to ensure that those money and those support like come there.
All right, time is against us, unfortunately, so we're not going to be able to get to all the questions. My apologies for that, but certainly a very incredibly rich discussion. I'm now going to give the floor to Lord Malloch Brown for any closing reflections, sir. A few minutes for that.
Well, thank you for your wonderful chairmanship of this. And if I may, thanks to Amina, the DSG, for staying with us throughout. I thought one of the great advantages of Zoom as an old overworked Deputy Secretary General myself was you could slip off once you'd done the introduction. So Amina, I'm grateful to you, my dear friend, for sticking with us throughout. And let me just say by way of closing, I mean, I was seeing in the chat room Sarah Pantalino's question, which you read out, about, you know, how do you really get results and not just rhetoric? I mean, she put it more politely than that. And another friend, Fawzia Rashid, a question which wasn't asked, you know, pressing on, well, okay, the role's changing, you know, resources are going to be tighter. How are you going to deliver on this? And, you know, I think there will probably be a period of intense reflection inside UN funds and programs, and indeed across the whole UN system, where I think there has to be this focus on where is the comparative advantage. And, you know, I still believe it is on trying to get governments to adopt enforceable targets, to move from the voluntary to the more enforceable. And you've seen, for example, in climate change, that steady journey. It's a quarter of the way along the road. We're a long way from the enforceability we would like to see. But I've seen in so many development areas, you know, the steady progress towards a stronger, more accountability with teeth. And I think this is a critical job for the UN programs. But, you know, as they focus on that, they've got to get smart about their delivery models, because, you know, they're going to need to put resources into the campaigning and convening roles, and yet they would be betraying their constituency of beneficiaries if they left them less served, if all the money went to PR in around the world. So really finding ways to leverage new partners and new resources into the area, using all the innovation of a new generation of civil society and NGO partners I've described, and all we heard from Kesi about youth. If you can harness that energy as your partners to deliver at the field level, it may free you to do the kind of thing that I tried to do with the MDGs, and much more boldly Amina has done with the SDGs. And so I think you're going to have to consider that kind of, if you like, rebooting, reprioritizing for this new era, because more than ever, what's always been the curse of the UN is you can't do anything, and making choices is the key bit of effective UN leadership, I think.
Lord Mark Malloch Brown, I received a private message from the Deputy Secretary General. She says this: from the mother of the SDGs to the father of the MDGs, they were not overtaken but remain unfinished business and are reflected in the first 6 SDGs. I think that was a message for someone. I'm just the moderator. Thank you, sir, for your reflections and for all those insights today. It's been a pleasure listening to you, and congratulations on an excellent lecture. And I'll give the floor to Dr. Natalia Canon for any closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Sherwin. I'd like to thank all the participants from all around the world for your presence today, and certainly the panelists, but most of all, the lecturer, Lord Malloch Brown, who rose magnificently to the occasion and delivered a challenging and very thoughtful lecture. Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to also add a word of gratitude to the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, to Ambassador Skog, to Kessie Ekomoswanye, and a special thanks to Menchu, Ambassador Salas, for keeping Mr. Salas's legacy and his vision alive. It's something that all of us at UNFPA endeavor to do every day in our work. And I must congratulate our brilliant moderator, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, and appreciate all UN staff. Today, the lecture has been a testament to the spirit and the intent of the Salas lecture. It's also a reminder to us of what it's going to take to really leave no one behind. The pandemic is holding up a magnifying glass, and we're seeing the deep inequalities. We're seeing all the isms, including racism, which persist throughout societies. And still, the pandemic gives us an opportunity to reset. We should not allow COVID-19 to dictate our future course of action. We need to march forward. The SDGs, yes, remain our blueprint. And for UNFPA, there really can be no sustainable development goals without the antecedent ICPD, that International Conference on Population and Development, and its platform, and the international community that it represents. NGOs were present in Cairo 26 years ago, as they were in Beijing the year later. At this moment, we have to admit that the international community is stretched, that resources are strained, and our resolve has to match that. Our resolve has to get firmer day by day. Our achievement of the rights of women and girls should get closer with every act of solidarity. And there is no strength without unity. So let us seize every opportunity. Let us open our minds. Let us open our investment attitude. And let us reach out, even if it's a virtual reach out across the aisles. Because there's a 12-year-old girl who is counting on us wherever she may be. And together, I really believe that we can deliver on her rights, her choices, her future, her hopes, and her dreams. Thank you very much for joining.
I thank Dr. Canon for her remarks and for everyone's participation in this event. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for the 16th Rafael M. Salas Memorial Lecture. I'm told we had about 900 people watching, which is something in this virtual world, 900 people watching proceedings online. It's been a real pleasure being your moderator. Thanks everybody for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.